It started as any other undercover operation. 2 experienced RCMP officers, men. A female officer on one of her first undercover assignments. Her job to hang on her colleague's arm, impress the target, help solve a crime. But by the time the night was over, there'd be a new potential crime. The victim, the female officer herself, assaulted, she would later claim, by her RCMP colleague.
I woke up and Rob was all over me. He's kind of a big guy. He had his hands in my clothes, under my clothes.
For years, she refused to tell, until she learned there were more.
She had a very serious allegation of a sexual assault, of having been raped.
First on my plate, we'll be addressing the issue of harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace.
Tonight on the Fifth Estate, the story of 4 women who signed up to serve and protect, and who charged Canada's iconic police force with failing to protect them. Good evening, I'm Gillian Findlay. The stories just keep on coming. Women, members of the RCMP, emerging to share difficult, painful stories of harassment and abuse. Some are recent, some stretch back decades. But for insight into how this country's national police force deals with these kinds of allegations, few stories match the one we're about to tell you tonight. The claims were set out in a lawsuit. As you'll hear, the story stretched all the way to RCMP headquarters in Ottawa. But it started in Calgary with a young female officer looking to prove herself in the toughest police racket of all, the undercover unit. For as long as she can remember, Victoria Cliff dreamed of being a police officer.
I think I probably knew when I was 2 or 3 years old. I mean, I grew up in a policing family. Grandpa, my dad, all of my uncles, and of course you gather uncles along the way, of course, my dad's friendships and stuff like that, so yeah.
And what is it that appealed to you?
Just the diversity of the work, you know. It was a good job, solid job. My dad loved his work. So I mean, you want to get into something that you're passionate about. So that's where I went.
Her timing was good. By the late 1980s, women were coming of age in the RCMP. Gone were the days they graduated in skirts and heels. By then, there was an understanding, however grudging in some quarters, that the girls were up to the job. Discrimination and harassment were things Victoria didn't even think about.
I don't know, maybe it was my own ego or my own arrogance, but I never thought it would touch me. I never even considered it would happen. I never saw any of my friends who were policemen treat other female members that way.
Her first posting was in small-town Alberta. She liked the work, but always wondered what it would be like to run with the big boys in Calgary. In particular, the stars of the show, the undercover unit, the UC. One day, the phone rang. At the other end, a constable, Robert Blundell, with an opportunity.
He had contacted me and said that he was working on a UC and knew that I was interested in the program.
The first thing Blundell wanted were photos of Victoria to impress the target of the operation, a suspected murderer. The goal was to earn his confidence, and pretty women would help. Eye candy, they called them, window dressing. Provocative attire was part of the lure, and so was a lot of booze.
Well, I met him at the hotel, and we grabbed some beer, and then we went to the site where we were supposed to meet up with the target. And it was outside of Calgary. And we just hung out there and drank beer and waited for them to show up, and eventually they did.
There was a lot of drinking that went on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did that strike you as strange?
I wasn't really paying attention to how much drinking was going on. I guess at the time, I know we were drinking beer, but I mean, like, I wasn't pounding back beer. I was having a few beers. After that, we went to a licensed establishment and carried on from there.
The hope was the target would reappear at the bar. At least that's what Victoria was told. He never did, but the party continued anyway.
And Sergeant Blundell started buying tequila shots. And I can't even remember how many, but he kept coming back with them, and I don't drink hard liquor. So when nobody was looking, I was dumping them into a shrub that was in the bar. It was a fig tree or something, I think. And, or I just put it down on a table and walk away from it. But I wasn't drinking them.
And he was drinking them?
Yep, yes.
So this goes on for some time, yeah?
A couple hours.
Uh-huh. And are you drunk at this point?
You know, I wasn't falling down like totally inebriated, but yeah, I'd had too much to drink. Yeah.
Too much to drink and in no condition to drive home. It didn't matter. She'd been told earlier that a room had been reserved for her at the hotel that night, but that didn't turn out to be true either.
So we get back to the hotel, and Blundell told me that there had been a mix-up, that he couldn't get a room for me. Whatever, the hotel was booked up, and I was just going to crash in his room on a couch. And we went into Blundell's room, and there was no couch.
What did you think?
Well, you know, I didn't really think much of anything, to be quite honest. I mean, it was, so I'm like, well, you know, got to sleep somewhere. So he said, well, we'll just, you know, sleep on half the bed and I'll sleep on the other half. So I went into the washroom, I came back out, he was in bed, I came back out and got, like, I didn't get under the covers, I got on top of the covers but under the bedspread, and went to sleep.
And then what happened?
Then I woke up and sorry.
That's okay. Take your time.
I woke up and Rob was all over me. He's kind of a big guy. He had his hands in my clothes, under my clothes, and I kept pushing him away, and he persisted. So I started pushing him away again, and he still came back at me.
What was he actually doing to you?
Well, when I woke up, his hand was right between my legs and his fingers were inside of me, and his other hand was up underneath my ribs, and he had a hold of my breast. So I pushed him away and pretended to be asleep at the onset because I thought maybe he'd just stop and leave me alone, and he didn't.
I'm struck because this is 17 years ago now, and yet it still can bring you to tears like this.
Yeah. Nobody expects that from their partner or from their peer. It wasn't expected, it wasn't warranted. I didn't ask for it. I never gave him any indication I was interested in it. It was just out of left field.
Eventually, she says, he fell asleep. But even when she could, she didn't run. She agrees it doesn't make a lot of sense. Today, she puts it down to inexperience, a misguided sense of professionalism.
I never even thought about leaving because we were still to continue the scenario the next day. And we're working on a very serious criminal matter. I mean,
how do you explain that to people? I mean, I know you're a professional, but...
I don't know if you can explain that to people, and I've never really tried, quite frankly. I call it, you know, simply you're there to complete a task. That's what your job is. I'll call it dedication to duty or whatever else. I mean, it happened, it stopped. We had things, very important things to get done the next day. In my mind, they were very important. I don't know what they were in his mind. That's what I thought we were doing.
So what happened the next morning hit like a bombshell. Having worked late into the night, Blundell now told her she hadn't been authorized to be on the undercover operation at all. For everyone's sake, she should just go home and keep quiet. For Victoria, that's when the penny dropped.
I think he just wanted to tag another female member. I don't think it had anything to do with me being on the scenario. I mean, it was never cleared through K Division, I found out later. I was never authorized to be down there. There was no cover team in place. I mean, and all these things in retrospect, I should have known, but I was junior, and he was a seasoned member of the RCMP and an operator. I had no idea. But the purpose was to see who he could sleep with.
Her dilemma now was what to do about it. She thought about reporting the assault, but decided she just couldn't.
I was embarrassed. Yeah, I was embarrassed. I didn't want anybody to know. Maybe I let my guard down and I shouldn't have.
Did you blame yourself?
Probably, yeah.
For 6 years, she would keep the secret, until the day she discovered she was not alone.
Robert Blundell put his arm around me and whispered in my ear, he said, if I touch you, just go with it. And as we were walking towards the target, he fondled my breast.
In the world of police investigations, this is the big time. Going undercover to befriend criminals and learn their secrets is demanding, dangerous work. The officers who do it, the police equivalent of rock stars.
Did you see it happen? Yeah.
But even today, it's still very much a man's world. Women are often the decoration, and the traditional standards of policing don't always apply.
I think they play by a different set of rules. You know, they have access to drugs, they have access to liquor and alcohol and staging areas and props.
Back in 1994, Constable Krista Carley thought it all sounded pretty exciting. She'd been with the RCMP just 3 years in a rural detachment outside Calgary. And one day, she too got an opportunity.
One of my supervisors, a sergeant at the time, took me into his office and said there's going to be an opportunity to do some window dressing, is what he termed it, to do an undercover operation with some people from Calgary. Would you be interested? And I said, sure, I would love to do it.
The people from Calgary included Constable Robert Blundell. He was a seasoned police officer. Because he worked undercover, it's hard to find a photograph of him. Once again, the team met the target in a scrapyard. And once again, the liquor began to flow. Constable Carley was posing as the girlfriend when the acting got a little too real.
Robert Blundell put his arm around me and whispered in my ear, he said, if I touch you, just go with it. And as we were walking towards the target, he fondled my breast.
And prior to this, did he or anybody else say, look, we're all play acting here, be prepared, we might have to act in a way that...
No, there was nothing. I was in the scenario. I didn't want to blow the operation. I didn't want to turn around and slap him in the face or turn around and say, get your hands off me. I just basically froze.
Were you surprised?
I was, and it made me feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then it happened again.
It happened again?
Yeah, as another incident where we were talking to the target. He put his hands down the back of my shorts and touched my bottom through my underwear.
And what did you think?
And I just felt sick. I just felt humiliated and used and embarrassed, and I never said anything.
Why not?
I didn't want to blow the operation, and I didn't know what to do.
And so she did nothing. They went to the bar and later back to the hotel. It was there Blundell suggested they continue discussing the case upstairs.
He said, why don't you come up to my hotel, come up to the hotel room for a little while? I said, no, I really need to get home. And at that time, I had consumed maybe 6 or 7 beer over the course of the day and in the evening. And I probably shouldn't have been driving a car, but all I could think about was I want to get in my car, I want to go home, I want to be somewhere safe.
Did you feel unsafe with him?
I did. I had just my sixth sense saying, don't go up there, don't even think about it.
Her instincts also told her that even though she was a police officer, sworn to uphold the law, there was no way she could report what happened.
I just knew that if I ever said what happened to me, that a floodgate would open. I thought, oh my gosh, I will make so many enemies if I tell them that we were drinking in a police car, that we were drinking during the course of the investigation, that the operators were drinking heavily. I would be highly criticized for doing that. So I was very fearful for coming forward.
The fear that would ensure Constable Carley's and Constable Victoria Cliff's silence would keep other women quiet as well. According to a lawsuit filed years later, Blundell's alleged predatory behavior didn't stop. Another female officer claimed that in 1996 he made unwanted sexual advances towards her, ripping her blouse and grabbing her breasts. A year after that, there was a fourth incident. This time, the allegation was rape. That police officer still won't speak publicly. But according to the lawsuit, the incident started in a familiar way. Her role was to pose as a party girl who Blundell would pick up in order to impress the target. At the end of the evening, the woman admits she returned to Blundell's hotel room for a debrief and another drink. Eventually, she fell asleep. According to her statement of claim, when she awoke, Blundell was sexually assaulting her. She tried pushing him away, but he pushed back, bruising her arm and her breast. The assault continued, she says, until he ejaculated. Like the other three women, the officer did not tell. But then after psychological counseling, she decided the silence had to be broken. She filed a formal complaint against Blundell that police would now have to investigate. Calls went out to other women who had worked with him, including Victoria Cliff.
And she said, well, there's an investigation going on, and they want to talk to you. And I said, I'm not interested in talking to them. I just didn't want to deal with it. So the last thing she said to me is, you really need to think about this. So I did start to think about it. And, you know, you wrestle with it for a while, but the bottom line is that you're a police officer and you're paid to do what's moral and right. And how do you go to work every day and interview women who've been sexually assaulted? And not have the strength to do it yourself. So, you know, like I said, how do you ask somebody to step forward to say, you know, to bear the most intimate details of an act to the public, and you don't have the guts to do it yourself? Because I knew what the cost was going to be. Yeah, I was pretty sure when I came forward, my career was going to be over.
The women were assured their complaints would be kept confidential, but it only took days, Victoria says, before that promise was broken and the retaliation began.
There was rumors and stories being told about me in different sex acts with different people. It was an all-out smear campaign, I guess is the best way to put it. Rumors, lots of innuendo, just swirling around my work environment all the time.
At the time, Victoria was part of the RCMP's emergency response team, one of only a few women trained as a hostage negotiator. She says once word leaked out that she'd made allegations against Blundell, her assignments dried up.
And I really enjoyed that job. I mean, I went to a call-out and sat in a chair in a hallway because they wouldn't utilize me.
Really?
Really.
Because why?
Well, because I came forward with the allegations, I would think. It got to the point where I no longer cared about my job anymore. I had an idealism of what police work was about, what policemen were about, what was moral and what was ethical, and I watched all that go up in smoke.
By the time Krista Carley was convinced to lodge her complaint against Blundell, she was already off on sick leave. She'd had an earlier experience with harassment that she felt the force hadn't taken seriously. That and the stress of the Blundell incident, she says, resulted in the breakup of her marriage.
It was shortly after that that then I started seeking counseling and talking about it. Because if you hold a secret for too long, it eats you up inside. And that's what it did to me.
And the more she thought about it, the more she came to believe that what happened that day in the scrapyard was no accident.
So you think you were recruited?
Yeah.
But not necessarily just to do the undercover work?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was all part of his game. I think they just invited me along for the ride in hopes that, you know, that I would sleep with one of them. I think that's what it came down to.
On the strength of the four women's stories, Calgary police considered criminal charges against Blundell. Crown Counsel was consulted. Charges were never laid. That left the RCMP's own internal disciplinary process. Initial investigations there substantiated 3 of the claims, meaning they'd now go to an adjudication board, which could, if it decided, punish Blundell, even fire him.
I thought that there would be some discipline, and I thought there would be some repercussions, some accountability. We trusted our employer to step up to the plate and do the right thing.
But even before the adjudication hearings began, another bombshell. 2 of the women mysteriously found themselves targets of investigations. A fellow officer, the same man in both cases, accused them of unbecoming conduct. In Constable Cliff's case, of inappropriate relations with another undercover officer.
Was it coincidence that this happened at that time?
Do I think it was a coincidence? Absolutely not. I think it was meant to do exactly what it was trying to do, which was discredit me and ruin my reputation, further ruin my reputation as a police officer.
So that when it came to a hearing, you would not be a credible
Where's my
witness?
credibility now? Yeah. Yeah.
The women were eventually cleared of the charges, but not before the hearings began. The first up was the constable who claimed she'd been raped by Robert Blundell in the hotel room. Under the RCMP Act, 3 senior officers would decide the case. The RCMP appointed the prosecutor. Blundell had a lawyer and a staff association rep. But the women had no official standing at the hearing. If they wanted representation, they'd have to hire their own, Calgary lawyer Angela Byrne.
It was disgusting what happened in that hearing.
For Byrne, the strength of the case was in the numbers and the shockingly similar scenarios. 4 policewomen, the same alleged perpetrator. On the day of the first hearing, she made sure Victoria and one of the other women were in the courtroom ready to testify. But the prosecutor didn't believe that evidence would meet the legal test for admissibility. Byrne still disagrees.
The prosecution didn't involve calling any similar fact evidence, despite the fact that everyone knew that there was similar fact evidence that could be called.
There were 3 other women who had similar complaints
Very similar.
against the same officer.
All against the same officer, all involving sexual assaults that took place within or surrounding undercover operations.
And why wasn't that considered to be relevant in this case?
I have no idea. It was unbelievable that you would have that kind of evidence to corroborate this complaint.
Why do you think it didn't happen?
I don't think their allegations were taken seriously. I don't think there was a real desire to get at the truth.
The board started from the position that what happened in the hotel room was not rape, but inappropriate sexual relations. The woman's story that she'd been drunk and Blundell had taken advantage was found to have major discrepancies and factual errors. Blundell's account that they were sober and the sex had been consensual was found to be believable. In its ruling, the board accused the woman of trying to minimize her role in what happened when confronted by her boyfriend. It insisted it was sensitive to the issues of sexual harassment, but we must first believe the constable, and we do not. The board feels she sincerely believes her testimony to be true, but thinks she may be honestly mistaken. The bottom line, Blundell was acquitted. For Victoria, on deck for the next hearing, it was ridiculous.
My personal opinion was it was laughable, and that I had no intention after leaving there to put myself through the same thing. I'm not going to be treated like this. Like this is a joke. Nobody's taking this seriously.
By 2001, allegations that an RCMP undercover officer had sexually assaulted 4 of his female colleagues were working their way through the force's internal disciplinary process. At the first hearing, the officer, Robert Blundell, now a sergeant, was acquitted. The other women bringing charges were devastated.
It was tragic to watch her go through that.
It was her word against his at the end of the day, and they believed
He
him.
said, she said, yep.
Were you surprised that...
Once again, yes, I was.
Yeah?
You know, I don't know why I kept the perpetual optimism, I guess, the thinking that, once again, good was going to triumph over evil, for lack of a better term. And I kept always thinking that, you know, this is going to change, you know, this is going to get better. Somebody's going to step up and make sure that this is going to go right. And it never happened.
By now, the women's confidence in the RCMP to hold Blundell accountable was fading. They weren't impressed with how the force's prosecutor had handled the first hearing, so the 2 women who would face Blundell next wrote a letter to then Deputy Commissioner Beverly Busson, demanding she appoint a new prosecutor. She did, going outside the force and hiring BC lawyer Jennifer McCormick.
They didn't have a lot of confidence in their employer. They were angry, and they were pretty defensive when I first met them.
But as the women worked with McCormick, a veteran criminal lawyer, they came to trust her, just as she came to trust them. So as you listened to these women's stories, did they strike you as credible?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You didn't doubt what they were telling you?
Not for 1 second. They were just, they were believable. That's all I can say. I mean, I just have to make an assessment of their credibility.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't walk away saying, well, maybe there's exaggeration going on here, maybe it was consensual.
No. People don't make those kinds of complaints given the environment that they work in. People don't just come forward with those kinds of complaints. They just don't.
With just 3 weeks to prepare, McCormick threw herself into the file and discovered that one of the original charges against Blundell, that he'd recruited Victoria Cliff to work undercover without authorization, had been dropped. Her opening salvo was going to be to get the charge reinstated. She was also pushing to change the sentence if Blundell was found guilty. Not the 10 days docked pay the first prosecutor wanted, but the maximum possible.
I would have been making a submission that he should be terminated from the RCMP.
Lose his job?
Yes.
He turfed out. That's how serious it was.
In my view, it was.
She never got the chance. On day 2 of the hearing, Blundell's lawyer approached McCormick. His client wanted to negotiate. She was floored.
This member had adamantly denied each and every allegation that had been made. And in addition to that, I expected him to be quite confident given that he had not been found culpable in respect of the earlier matter.
So you weren't expecting that he was going to plea bargain his way out of it?
Not a chance.
So what did you think when it was put on the table?
I didn't know what to think. I was completely taken aback. But my job is to take instructions from my client.
Now, McCormick's client was actually the Deputy Commissioner, Bev Busson. She'd asked for McCormick to be hired. She'd authorized the process against Blundell. The women were on the verge of getting their day in court. But now there was an opportunity for a deal. The next morning, a very senior officer arrived to make sure it happened. Unbeknownst to just about everyone, Peter German, then an RCMP superintendent, had flown into Calgary. McCormick was preparing to go back into court when she got his call.
I couldn't figure it out. I was stunned. absolutely stunned. And I remember thinking, like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And I was actually, to be honest with you, angry that he was there.
Why?
Well, because, I was hired presumably for my capabilities and my ability to conduct the matter. And I was doing that.
So what did he tell you? Why was he there?
To get the matter done.
Those were his words.
He wanted it resolved. Like they wanted it resolved.
And by the end of the day, it was. McCormick, who'd been hired to prosecute the allegations against Blundell, says she now felt extraneous to the process, and so did the women.
They were exceptionally unhappy. I can't emphasize that enough. They wanted to have a hearing. They wanted to get in the witness box. They wanted to be heard. They were prepared, and they were ready to go. They didn't come there to have this back and forth and to have this resolution forced on them, and that's how they felt.
I was shocked. We were in the middle of an adjudication. We had a prosecutor. We had a defense lawyer. I don't know what the requirement was for him to intervene.
We asked now Deputy Commissioner Peter German for an interview to explain why he intervened. He declined our request. Under his mediation, a statement of facts was agreed. Blundell, who until this point had denied assaulting the women in any way, now admitted to discreditable conduct, touching private areas of Constable Cliff on top of her clothing, and in the case of the other woman, grabbing her breast.
The agreement said that he had touched you, but only with your clothes on.
Yeah, I did have my clothes on, but he wasn't touching me on top of my clothes. Absolutely. And that's why I'm saying it was very minimized.
Did you say anything at the time?
Oh, I was livid. I was absolutely livid when we left there. I couldn't even, I believe there was a group of people standing outside talking, and I couldn't even speak. I was just, wow.
But it didn't matter what she thought. The deal was done. Blundell, who had been on track to become an inspector, was reprimanded, recommended to counseling, and docked 1 day's time off.
It was disappointing, I guess, is the best way I can put it. I don't know what I expected to happen, but I was very disappointed with what happened.
Disappointed but surprised?
I wasn't surprised by anything at that point. When I walked out of that courtroom, I don't think anything more would have surprised me.
You had a pretty clear understanding of...
It was very clear.
And what was clear? What did you understand?
This was going away, and it was dealt with, and it was a done deal, and nothing was going to change.
It's been 10 years since the RCMP dispensed with Victoria Cliff's allegation of sexual assault, reprimanding the officer she says attacked her and docking him a day's time off. She's still a police officer at a detachment on Vancouver Island, but the journey back to believing in the institution she so proudly joined has been a hard one. In 2003, she and 3 other female officers launched a lawsuit against the RCMP for covering up the assaults and failing to protect them. The list of defendants included all of their bosses, right up to the commissioner at the time, Giuliano Zaccardelli. He flew the women to Ottawa to hear their complaints firsthand.
I do remember part of the conversation was, I said, you've got a problem with your force. And he said, it's our force. And I said, not if it's like this, it's not. I want nothing to do with it if it's like this.
The former commissioner declined our request for an interview, so we don't know what he made of the women's claims. We do know he was concerned enough about their lawsuit to order a review of how their cases had been handled internally.
My overall impression was that the way things were managed from investigation to disposition left a fair bit of room for improvement.
Retired RCMP Superintendent Ian Atkins conducted the review, It took months. He interviewed dozens of RCMP members. But his report has never been made public until now. We obtained a copy through access to information. It's far from congratulatory. On the punishment handed out to Sergeant Robert Blundell, Atkins was surprised, especially since after denying the assaults, Blundell later switched his story and cut a deal, admitting sexual attacks happened.
Integrity for a police officer is paramount. If you can't trust your police officers to be honest, then you've got a problem.
You're a former superintendent. Would you want somebody like that in the RCMP?
If I was conducting a hearing and I believed that the officer was dishonest,
And he just admitted to being dishonest.
I would seriously consider dismissal.
You think that's what should have happened?
In this case, probably yes.
So why didn't it? And why at the 11th hour did a senior officer, Superintendent Peter German, get involved in making the deal?
How it was expressed to me by Superintendent German was that this is apparently the first time that Sergeant Blundell had actually admitted to misconduct.
So?
And it felt that that was a step forward.
Atkins doesn't dispute German's motivation. He calls him a man of integrity with long experience in adjudication. But he won't say the intervention was appropriate.
It's an unusual intervention. In my history in the RCMP, I'm not aware or if that has occurred in the past.
Was it helpful to justice that he did what he did?
The two complainants would say absolutely no, it was not helpful to justice. I believe that the outcome was lighter than it should have been. If there are lessons to be learned from dispositions that are given, which is one of the objectives of discipline, so others can learn from others' mistakes, then it probably didn't achieve that objective either. So from that perspective, it probably wasn't beneficial for the administration of justice.
Now, there's something else that came out of the review of that deal that German helped negotiate and the deputy commissioner approved. Atkins discovered that in addition to the 4 women who'd made the initial complaints against Blundell, there were 3 more allegations that he'd had inappropriate sexual relationships. A 4th was uncovered as the review proceeded. We asked the RCMP whatever happened to those new claims. They were investigated, we were told, but in each case were deemed to be unfounded. Victoria Cliff, who'd never seen the Atkins report until we showed her, was not surprised.
I was aware during the investigation that there was other women, but those women weren't willing to come forward at the time. I mean, you have to remember that there was women I worked with that watched what I was going through, that had absolutely no desire to live through that. And who could blame them?
As much as the RCMP would like to move on, the issue of sexual harassment refuses to go away. Just last month, a woman who'd been one of the force's most recognizable faces came forward with her own allegations.
Arrested 1 male. If I had a dime for every time one of my bosses asked me to sit on his knee, I'd be on a yacht in the Bahamas right now.
As she watched that interview, Krista Carley, who trained with Galliford, knew it was time for others to come forward too. She decided to speak out about her experience with Robert Blundell.
It just broke everything open for me again. I thought, things haven't changed. Here's somebody else that's gone through horrendous harassment, that was a really good police officer, that was a valued spokesperson for the RCMP, and I've got to support her, so that's why I came public.
So enter the RCMP's new commissioner, Robert Paulson.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Congratulations.
In his first television interview since getting the job, Paulson made it clear he has no higher priority than tackling harassment, and he's not afraid to come down hard.
I think that Canadians want to be confident and they want to be reassured by the force's ability in those cases where behavior is outrageous, it's clearly made out, that there are immediate and quick sanctions brought to bear on those offenders. I'm committed to that, and we today agreed, the commanding officers, and I've given instructions to them to go forward and make that live. So that's going to be happening.
So given that, we wondered what he made of the Robert Blundell case. Blundell never did make it to the RCMP's executive ranks as an inspector, but 1 year after admitting sexual assault, he was promoted again.
I know that there's criticism around about his promotion to staff sergeant, but let's face it, that was a significant sanction. I like to think that the Blundell case has been resolved.
The women who brought allegations certainly don't see it as being resolved.
No, fair enough. I get that.
They live with the consequences still.
They do live with the consequences.
Their careers didn't progress in the same way. One of them actually left the force.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, that's fair. But what's not fair is to extrapolate from those facts to the way the force handles harassment. And I think we've got a fairly good record in a large number of discipline cases, and we can do better.
You can do better.
Absolutely, we can do better, and I'm committed to doing better.
But for some of the women, it's too late. They eventually settled their lawsuit with the RCMP, but Constable Krista Carley never did return to work. Her policing career is over. As for Victoria Cliff, there were certainly days she wanted to quit, but she persevered, earning a commendation for training work she did in Bosnia. At one time, she too dreamed of becoming an RCMP commissioned officer. She has yet to make it past the rank of corporal.
If you had a daughter, would you want her to become an RCMP officer if that's where her career aspirations took her?
If we change as an organization, a positive organization, you know what, yes. Simple answer is yes.
Because you didn't quit. You could have walked away from this.
No, you know, I never could have walked away. I'm not like that. This was something that bound and determined for whatever was going to happen. I was not walking away from this.
Why?
Because I stepped forward to do the right thing, and I wanted to make sure the right thing happened. And I still want to make sure that the right things happen. I mean, not for my daughter, but for whoever's daughter, you know? Why shouldn't she be able to be in the RCMP and not worry about this kind of thing happening to her? I mean, there's lots of things to worry about in the world, but being safe at work amongst your peers is not one of those things.
We, of course, wanted to speak with Robert Blundell, but he too declined our request. Through his lawyer, he sent us this statement. Staff Sergeant Blundell has been a diligent and conscientious officer for 30 years and supervisor to many men and women who have worked with and for him. Stay with us. The Fifth Estate will return. Welcome back. We have crews in the field working on stories you'll see in the weeks ahead on the Fifth Estate. If you'd like to know more about our program, you can find us at cbc.ca/fifth. You can also keep up with developments on past shows, like the dramatic news that followed our story on Scouts Canada. That's our program for tonight. I'm Gillian Findlay, and for everyone here at the Fifth Estate, thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.